Dead and Inked. Written by Ace the Undead. Read by Arashi. Wriothesley was aware that he wasn't really helping himself here. By the fights in the ring were the only way any form of release was possible. The punches, taunts, and jabs were nothing when compared to the knots in his back, or were the tiny hands he can still feel turning cold. Sigewinne told him it wasn't good to put so much pressure on his body. Wriothesley wished he could cry out the pressure of the ring, the roar of blood in his ears, and all injuries acquired while in the ring were nothing. But he never would shout at Sigewinne, not the little Melusine nurse. She was doing her job, so he would nod his head along and give some false hope to the frustrated nurse. She stopped saying as much as the years went by. That, too, would be enough of a reason for the knots in Wriothesley's back to increase tenfold. So, even after his sentence was served, and he was no longer a scrawny teen in the ring, punching with no regards for anything but pain, he continued his little game of atonement. Sure, it was less frequent. As warden, he couldn't be seen as somebody who might snap. As a person in charge must be a level-headed one. Still, he relished in the rare occasions he was in the ring. The bruised knuckles, sore muscles, and bleeding noses replaced the regular voices of guilt with ones of hate. It took so much less, though, to hate. Some would beg to differ, to disagree. They would say that hate, the emotion, was so charged with energy and emotion that it simply was not worth the hassle. Those people are those who get to have their grief, to embrace it until it's nothing more than the past. Wriothesley does shake with jealousy at those people. Nevertheless, whatever emotion you say is more wasteful, it doesn't change much. Wriothesley hunches over the empty ring, sweat dripping off his shoulders, and he feels the shakiness of his wrists returning now that they're given rest. An inmate had publicly voiced a grievance they had about him. Although Wriothesley liked to avoid personal confrontation with inmates, this one had been avid in dueling for his opinion. So, Wriothesley gave in rather easily. He might have been able to de-escalate the situation, but, if he was being honest, a fight was due. It was idiotic and selfish, but the guilt was loud recently. It was the anniversary of his court date, and, as always, Wriothesley could never just ignore his memories of the event. He straightened up. Sigewinne had told him hunching over would be bad for his back, although his back was almost certainly ruined from his year sleeping in shitty conditions, both inside the prison and out. He wanted to appease the nurse in some ways. He ran his hands through his hair, grimacing slightly at the slight dampness from his own sweat. "Duke, are you there?" A guard called out. Crap. Had he missed something important? He ran through the tasks for today in his head. The match had thrown it off a bit, but he was decently certain that he had done everything important. He cleared his throat before responding. "Yes? Is there a problem?" The door to the room swung open, and a female guard walked in. "No, sir. Just telling you that the inmate you fought is in perfectly fine condition. No lasting injuries." Wriothesley nodded. He had forgotten about the man altogether. His jaw clenched. He had hurt the man. Fought him. Was it so hard to remember to inquire about his health? Pinching the bridge of his nose, he waved the guard off, and once she left, he sunk to the floor. He felt like banging his head against the wall. It would do less harm to the people of the fortress than his idiotic, selfish fights. Well, he would have to supply costs to fix the wall. Perhaps too much trouble, both to explain and pay for. His own personal office would be better for such activities. He attempted to stand, and winced. A large bruise on the side of his stomach was forming. Clinging to the wall for support, he pulled himself up, his hands sweaty and twitching by the time he had stood up. He bit back a wince of pain. He couldn't feel his hands anymore. He ran his hands over his face, attempting to be as neutral as possible. He trudged back to his office, outwardly just looking pissed or constipated due to biting back pain. It had the benefit of nobody of the small crew of night guards bothering him. He locked the door. Always locked the door. The cold metal of the fortress wasn't comforting to most, but Wriothesley had spent a majority of his life here, and it, despite all its problems, was the closest he had to a proper home. And as he slumped into his desk chair, picking up a quill in an attempt to finish some financial reports he had let sit a little too long, the quill clattered to the desk almost instantly. His hands were still shaking. Wriothesley sucked in a breath, and took one of his hands in the other, bringing them close to his face. His hands were rather large, chipped nails and dried blood around his cuticles. They always felt hollow, cold. He winced as he curled his fingers in and out, almost hearing the scraping of his achy joints as they protested the movement. He heaved, the tiredness of his body taking over. He picked up the quill, wanting to do one thing worthwhile tonight. Fingers closed around it slowly and steadily dipped it into the ink pot. Pain shot through his whole left arm like a bloody, rusted bullet. He hissed in pain, and his arm jerked out of his control, sending the ink pot and its contents flying. The ceramic pot snapped to pieces as it hit the floor, the ink painted along paperwork, the desk carpet, at nearest wall. Wriothesley felt like crying. Cold little hands started tugging at his wrists. Numb, he stood up and picked up the broken ceramic, not caring for the blood that seeped out of his skin from where his knees hit the floor, or where he held the broken pieces too tight. He stayed there, kneeled on the floor for far too long. The carpet stain was probably not removable now. The cold holding his wrist tightened, little fingers wrapping around his own. He might have been crying. The difference between the stains of blood, ink, and tears on this carpet were indistinguishable to Wriothesley currently, although he's sure a blind man could tell the difference. Not Wriothesley. He simply stood up, swaying as he stumbled to his room at the back of his office. His nails scratched at the blood dried on his knees. He collapsed into his bed, the aches of his body and mind still following him as he slipped into a fitful sleep. He never knew. The REM phase of sleep was probably his least favorite thing, ever. Dreams turned to nightmares on a dime, replayed your worst mistakes. The fact was that all your dreams are the past, just shifted around. Bad news. Wriothesley's past is fucked in the head. It's the courtroom. The edges of the walls blurred at the panic felt in the moment. Colors blended together in a blotchy mess. Wriothesley was 16 again, in shitty clothes that hung off his frame, collarbones far too pronounced, and eye bags so deep that they felt ingrained in his face. He panics in dreams. He hates being 16 again. The wobble in his knees as the guards push him along. The bump in the red carpet he tripped over. That made the guards think he was fighting. Cold metal pressed against his neck. Walked up. Led to his fate. He turned his head away as he walked past his testifying siblings. He couldn't face them. It didn't matter if their eyes held fear or admiration for his actions. He was still an utter monster. He stood tall in the court, showing courage he really didn't feel. People were excited. Excited. Idiots. Wriothesley would not give these sick, gossip-seeking morons more fuel. When asked, he confessed every detail, down to the rays of sun offset on the windows. When asked how he pled, he said guilty. no matter the charge. The courtroom's bleeding colors became violent murmuring filled the air. The tension was palpable. Farina left the courtroom, most likely bored. Wriothesley imagined in that moment that he, insignificant in the court, in this nation, had disturbed these people. He had made them feel guilt for their excitement. Good. Live with that guilt. See the world with knots on your back and weight on your shoulders. Then the colors bled back to pure blues, complete control taken in an instant. Wriothesley felt like he had been plunged into ice-cold water and broke the surface of every mask Wriothesley had prepared for this court. He had never looked up in the court. He glanced above his head, above the sea of people of the court. The person who caused order by the thick drum of his fingers, a man immortalized in nearly every sense of the word, Chief Justice, a man so untouchable by Wriothesley's standards that he didn't even acknowledge his presence in the very courtroom he commanded. The Chief Justice opened his mouth as if to speak, to damn Wriothesley to all help for his heinous crimes and even more lackluster performance in the court. 16 years old, Wriothesley is in both awe and fear of this man. He was stunningly beautiful, strikingly so, but his face was so cold. Loving such a person would be like loving a statue. Wriothesley's throat tightened up, and suddenly his chest felt far too small to contain his lungs and heart. His false confidence shattered, and shattered into hydro-shaped glasses. His throat was closing up. The members of the court started to warp, becoming mothers, fathers, siblings, cold little hands, weights and knots. Above them all, watching as they drowned Wriothesley in his own sin, was the ethereal man, skin shining and subtly purple eyes seeing straight through Wriothesley's body and out the other side, towards a brighter day. The day that Wriothesley drowned, that is. He could feel the air leave his lungs. He could cry now, drowning, surrounded by those who he hurt, who hurt him, and utterly torn apart by the Chief of Justice. Sins laid clear before a somber, slow death. He let out the last bit of air in his lungs and choked in the salty water of the sea, bubbles erupting uncomfortably from his cracked throat. He nearly screamed as he shot up in his sleep, teetering off the edge of his bed. He counted his breaths aloud until he could feel them return to normal, then surveyed the room cautiously. Wriothesley wasn't sure what he expected to see. It was dark, cold as normal. He had thrown a few pillows, and half his blanket was slipping off the bed due to his fitful sleeping. But that is almost to be expected. One thing darting in the corner of his eye was a clock, a gentle Osa light flashing the time. 3:24 a.m. Wriothesley groaned in the knowledge that no matter how much lavender tea he consumed, there would be no getting back to sleep tonight. He glanced through the crack in his office door. Still had to fix that. He half-heartedly walked over to his office, grimacing as he was met with the stained carpet and walls. He sighed, staring at the desk. Wriothesley scrubbed out most of the ink staining the wood with a bit of elbow grease and a rag. He rewrote the reports that were ruined by blotchy ink splatters. The stains on the wall couldn't be fixed overnight, so instead he shifted one of the cabinets in his office, the one filled to the brink with your typical office junk. It was just large enough to cover the ink on the wall. Wriothesley crouched down with the rag, intending to get the stains out of his carpet, but then was hit with that aching pain. It ran down his spine, yanking it like a handle, and his shoulders felt like they were being grated against his shoulder blades, shredding and chipping the bone off in little flakes. Wriothesley stood up from the couch, rubbing his back and attempting to rid his body of this grimy, aching pain, as he attempted to take his mind off of everything. Cold little hands. Of course, he would never be free of those hands, nor the pain, the chronic, agonizing pain. He wanted so badly to hold those little hands, to warm them, and feel them squeeze back. But they won't. He does not deserve that reassurance.